We're back with part 2 of our week 3 asynchronous lecture at Digital Media Literacy, Comp 2143. Taking some questions from Rosalind. I want to say Rosalind now, not Rosalind. I misspoke before. We want to get these names right, because you all are part of our community here. Let's see. Let's shift gears and look at a different text for a moment. Spencer's writing well in the 21st century. The author comments on copyrighted materials, noting that copyrighted materials can be used or reproduced without the copyright holder permission. Well, this created room for the following question, right? Do you believe there should be more stringent copyright laws? I hard disagree, maybe. I don't know. I feel like people navigate copyright laws quite well in the U.S., and I think those within the respective industries that we're exploring in media do quite well, and can, if anything, utilize networks, right? If they're networked individuals, as Aaron's questions allude to this week, but there are plenty of ways for them to find profit while still, selectively sharing samples of their work or permissions. I recently, for some of you that have had a few of these courses dating back to the beginning of the year, I attended an academic conference in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and it was a couple of blocks from the University of Toronto. And the University of Toronto has the largest media archive in the country there for select types of old, ephemeral film and media content. And so I was lucky enough to budget some of my time to go attend a tour of their university library, but then also the follow-up, the import of that, we went to a different building where they took us into the cool room, the storage room, where all of the archival films, like actual film canisters and things of that nature, are kept and preserved. And it's a magnificent experience. I still have a lot of digital pics that I was able to snap during that event that I haven't had the right opportunity to share yet. I look forward to I tried to capture the significance of that space and time and what's going on there. But anyway, not to get lost in thought, during that presentation, during the tour of the library, the comment was made that actually the U.S., someone was complaining about U.S. copyright, or rather the fair use, okay, academic fair use in particular. And the comment was made by one of the Canadian employees, okay, that oversees copyright on a lot of these materials much more stringent, much worse, if that's the right word. So that would be a point of disagreement depending on who we talk to, but much stricter overseas, internationally, than they are in the U.S. So that kind of gave me a different perspective on thinking about copyright usage, fair use in particular, and maybe we do have it pretty good here in the U.S. But we read from, not just the Spencer text, but we tried to stay up to date on numerous texts because this information is important to know. And for some of you coming up in the fall, we'll be offering our Media Law and Ethics course, where you will get to explore some of these topics in even greater detail. So, thank you there. There was an assertion made by Spencer: beware of fabrication by newspapers on websites. Yes, and this led me to the question: do you believe that fabrication is synonymous with fake news? A term we've used a lot in this course. And I went back to reread it closely for perspective, okay? And I don't know if it's one of the passages I earmarked or not, but 87. It is not. But I went and let's see. Let's read something just for fun. Page 87, top section creates important limitation. No, hey, let's pause. This is a great takeaway. If you've always skimmed over this in our syllabi, which you shouldn't, quote bottom of page 87. If in your writing you are going to quote from an author's work under the fair use doctrine, be sure the quote appears correctly. Attribute it to the author and do not quote out of context. Publishers often establish their own rules regarding fair use, usually citing a specific number of words that can be considered fair use. Oh, so there's an explanation. It gets muddy, people, all right? So different publishers may have different guidelines, and that's why you can feel like you have an understanding of it in one context and then it completely changes in a different. But such rules do not apply to copyright infringement cases. Remember, fair use, if questioned by the quoted author, is cited by the. Remember, fair use, if questioned by the quoted author, is decided by the courts. Okay. Given that there is no clear definition of fair use, it is wise to be cautious when using the doctrine of fair use. Fair enough, I say. All right. So, in terms of synonymous nature with fake news, sure, perhaps, but Spencer was identifying and talking about this. If we look at date of when this book came out and understand the author was probably writing 6 months to a year, sometimes more, but typically 6 months to a year before this edition would have released, then technically the book we're reading is just barely predating that mainstream contemporary emergence of that phrasing. Okay, so the fake news was a label applied to something, and it became as much a cultural label as it did a political label, as it did a journalistic or ethical label. Okay, and so we see all of these overlapping complications. But we're also seeing, and this is a real theme I observed that emerges in your questions this week, the shifting tide of linguistics. Okay, language is always in flux, and that's something we'll talk about more as we move through everyone's questions. Final question on Marcel Denise's text, a popular culture text from chapter 11. In effect, quote, the online stage is virtually synonymous with YouTube, end quote. Do you agree with the above statement by Denise, who noted that the online stage is virtually synonymous with YouTube? Is this true or false? Or elaborate if you will. Okay, so Denise is doing some. First of all, we can recognize and appreciate, by the way, the sort of prose-like storytelling style that Denise is applying to the popular culture text. I think the text reads well because of his writing style. It's informative without boring us to death. And I know that can sometimes, for many students, be a trap. So once again, we try to select the kinds of readings that can engage you while also, educating us or furthering, right, the conversations we're trying to have. I think Danisi's doing a little bit of armchair social theorizing, okay, with this lump sum statement about YouTube. It's more of a clever way. It's a shorthand of suggesting that that internet culture, that social platforms are changing the way we do business, and I mean business not just on an economic, way of thinking, but how we do business in our social networks, right? In our co-creation of culture. So that's something to think about. It's less a true or false and more of a what does he mean by that, right? And how does that information change the way we think about what digital culture, what impact it's having on society. Exciting stuff as we move along here. And let's look at a couple of quick questions from Elizabeth. So borderline psych out. Thought I was going to take another break. I've got a couple of minutes in me here. Elizabeth asks, what is the point of spreading fake news? What is the point of spreading fake news and or negative news? All right. So she's inspired a little bit by the spreadable media text. Why are we doing that? Well, I mean, human nature, right? Not everyone. We may all have been exposed to Arthurian legend as children, but does everyone, not everyone wants to grow up and be chivalrous, right? Like, there's certain virtues that meant a lot in medieval times that have lost considerable steam for modern Western culture, okay? Agree to disagree? But also, what's the point of spreading? What's the purpose of spreading fake news? To deceive, of course, to mislead, and then to take it further, to strike fear into people, right? To create a sort of social panic, which is a cynical tactic. Okay, so this is a cynical worldview operating in a digital space. But to take that cynical perspective even further, like, what's the end game? Well, as we're seeing, for example, one would be to strike fear and then capitalize on the negative hysteria, okay? Either for social, cultural, political, or financial gain. I think this is at the root of an example I brought up in our written discussion a couple of different weeks so far, and that would be Alex Jones and the InfoWars programming. Okay, InfoWars, sort of a syndicated radio show, but then it's also simulcast on the internet, and then you can, of course, buy in to get even more content, right? If you're like the ultra exclusive member or what have you. But this whole band, it may have started as kind of an outlandish, hard right take on events, talk radio from that neoconservative perspective, but it at some point morphed, right, metastasized into a very toxic and conspiracy theory laden, bit of programming. There was a bait and switch that occurred, and this type of thing is common in, I don't know, economics. It's something, you strike something that catches fire with your consumer base, and then you feed more in that direction. So if this is what happened here, and it's been going on for years and years, of course, this is not like a overnight sensation. But what we have seen in recent days is actual action. I'm still shocked that this even occurred. But in the last week or so, we've seen Facebook, Spotify, and some YouTube scrub their channels of a lot of this InfoWars content, okay? Because they're recognizing it was no longer a sort of performance art gimmick or just a talk radio source of information. It was creating actual physical real world complications in how our society does business. So it's highly problematic, and there thus emerges ethical conversations about what are the ramifications of this. This is a freedom of speech debate, of course. Okay, so and we're pretty protective of freedom of speech in this country, but now we're having to start having these conversations about, okay, well, how much hate speech is too much hate speech? Where is the line? Is it when too many people can be easily persuaded into negative action as a result of that expression? All right, so all of these types of questions weigh heavy on us. We have to consider them. It's important that we have a conversation about this, and it's ongoing. We don't settle it in a single conversation, but I think that is what's going on with it. It's become a business, and we'll continue to discuss it in this course and more to come.